Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to 20th Century Revolutions. Episode 1.6, The Philhellenes, the Greek Revolution, Part 4. Greece has figured heavily within the imagination of the Western world for a long time. But this fascination with the ancient pagans of the Eastern Mediterranean would really begin to peak in the early 19th century, a fact that, as we will see, would prove quite convenient for the Christian and not-so-ancient Greek revolutionaries of the time. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe slid into a kind of dull torpor as Metternich's Holy Alliance increasingly tightened its icy, conservative, anti-revolutionary grip on the continent. This was felt most acutely by war veterans who had seen their job and purpose snatched away from them with the great general's final defeat at Waterloo. Yet it was also felt by starry-eyed dreamers whose imaginations had been stirred by the great changes Napoleon had wrought across the continent. For many of these veterans, intellectuals, artists, and students who found themselves just sort of bored and milling around after Napoleon was out of the picture, the plight of the Greeks increasingly became an outlet for their restless spirits. These idealistic adventurers who felt drawn by the romantic allure of fighting alongside Greek heroes in their struggle for national liberation would become known as the Philhellenes, which just simply means a lover of Greek culture. Philhellenes have been around for as long as there has been European interest in ancient Greece, so like a really long time. But the Philhellenic movement really began to gain serious momentum during the Greek Revolution for a few reasons, possibly the most important of which was the simple fact that the cause of revolutionary Greece fit within this weird middle ground between the acceptable and unacceptable politics of post-Napoleonic Europe. As we've noted many times, Europe under Metternich had as its number one priority stamping out anything that even had the slightest whiff of revolution. This was because for the Holy Alliance of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, revolution meant only one thing: a Europe engulfed in war. And yet, even though it was quite obviously a revolution, what was going on in Greece was somehow thought of as just different. This had a lot to do with the fact that the Greeks were a Christian people attempting to throw off their oppressors who were Muslim. This simple fact meant that conservatives couldn't just write off the Greeks as frothing radicals who might want crazy things like a constitution. Even as a nationalist cause, which the Holy Alliance opposed just as fervently as constitutions, the Greek cause was still different because they were trying to liberate themselves from non-Christian rulers. This set them apart from contemporaneous movements currently squashed under Austrian and Russian hegemony, such as German or Italian nationalism, which were Christian on Christian affairs and which Metternich ruthlessly repressed. This tweener position of the Greek Revolution made it an ideal outlet for revolutionaries, political radicals, and romantic intellectuals who wished to express their nationalist dreams, but were unable to while under the scrutiny of Metternich's secret police. Then, on top of the fact that support for the revolutionary Greeks was more acceptable to the censors, interest in ancient Greece was deeply embedded in European culture, still under the sway of Enlightenment thought. This fascination with ancient Greece would become even more intense as the burgeoning movement of Romanticism was taking hold. And so, during the 1820s, Greece essentially became what we might today call a fad. And like all fads, Philhellenism took a little while to really capture the imaginations of a wide swath of European society and would begin with a handful of passionate believers on the leading edge of the movement. This vanguard was primarily made up of Napoleonic War veterans from all sides of the conflict, as well as intellectuals and artists, especially within this growing movement of European Romanticism. Early on, the movement was most popular in cities across what is today Germany and Switzerland, and Greek societies began sprouting up in these areas almost as soon as word of the Greek uprisings hit the newsstands. These areas of Central Europe were under the thumb of Metternich's secret police, and many students, professionals, war veterans, and local elites resented the censorship they were forced to live under. This was especially true for the closeted revolutionary nationalists, who at this time could only secretly dream of things such as a truly united German or Italian nation. With their own revolutionary dreams squashed under Metternich's conservative boot, many began to turn to the cause of Greek nationalism as basically a non-suicidal way in which to challenge the censors. After the initial creation of Greek societies in the spring of 1821, when the revolution was breaking out, there then began to be a growing number of individuals flocking to port towns on the Mediterranean, in places such as Marseille, France, to hop aboard ships headed for the Greek Isles. These early adventurers were mainly young people in their 20s who came from all over Europe, from places like Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, France, and England, and there were even some Americans thrown in there. These volunteers represented a pretty broad spectrum of society, but most were middle class: students, artisans, teachers, doctors, lawyers, artists, and merchants. And even though the vast majority were young men, there were also women who joined up, as well as teenage boys who had run away from home. Out of all of these groups, though, by far the most volunteers were drawn from the millions of former soldiers who had been set adrift after the fall of Napoleon. These veterans had seen their lives of noble adventure snatched away from them, and many did not cope well with the mundane trivialities of their post-war lives. And even though these veterans had fought both with and against the great emperor, Napoleon had inspired these people with a sort of revolutionary romantic heroism that could not simply be locked away now that the emperor himself had died in exile. So for many of these disillusioned veterans, the allure of seeking glory, liberating the land of the ancient heroes in Greece was just simply irresistible. The descriptions of these idealistic volunteers could at times be pretty comical. In Marseille, where many awaited the boats headed for Greece, these guys would just take over local cafes and bars, fully dressed in their military uniforms, medals and all, and start just giving speeches to anyone who would listen, going off on things like the great and noble ideas of liberty and freedom and glory and the superiority of the ancients. The French authorities did grow a bit concerned about these guys, but they would mostly just encourage them to, just go ahead and get on the boat. Greece is that way. There were also a lot of con artists within this, at times ridiculous collection of individuals. There was one story of a boy who had come from Stuttgart, Germany, and who was deaf and mute. This young man traveled to Marseille with a letter written by leaders of Greek societies in Stuttgart that confirmed he was in actuality a Greek of noble birth from the Greek town of Argos. Believing they had a Greek prince in their midst, this boy was given many gifts and offered a top-notch treatment as he journeyed from Marseille to the Peloponnese. However, once the volunteers reached Tripolitsa, the actual real-life Greeks living there noted that he lacked many of the Greek manners and customs that would be well known to a Greek native. Having been outed somewhat, this allegedly deaf and mute Greek prince then suddenly started speaking quite fluently in German, and it soon came to light that he had fooled both the school for the deaf and mute and the Greek societies in his hometown of Stuttgart. He had done this by imitating his brother, who really was deaf and mute, and then by randomly pointing to a map of ancient Greece to locate where he was from. Then he wrote just a bunch of random characters on a piece of paper that the quote-unquote Greek experts just assumed were modern versions of ancient Greek characters. Yeah, this story is pretty silly, but it also highlights an important aspect of the Philhellenic movement. namely that nearly all of these volunteers and enthusiasts were completely ignorant of what life was actually like in real-life, modern-day Ottoman Greece. The knowledge that most people had of Greece was simply taken from stories and mythology about ancient Greece. This meant that these volunteers largely expected to stroll up to the Peloponnese and be greeted by, Achilles and Odysseus waving them in, and then, oh look, it's Socrates and Plato discussing philosophy atop the Acropolis. They were in for quite a shock then when they instead entered a land that was primarily ruled by fractious Greek warlords and was populated by people who did not really look anything like their idea of Greek heroes, but instead wore the clothes of Ottoman Greek peasants. This shocking reality check was then compounded by the fact that many volunteers were arriving in the Peloponnese, which by the summer of 1821 had already largely been won by the Greeks. This meant that the Greeks of the Peloponnese were not currently the victims of Ottoman violence, though they definitely had been those victims quite recently. But at this point, they were instead themselves launching a campaign of retribution against the minority Muslim population of the peninsula. The sight of the Greek clefs robbing, pillaging, and murdering defenseless Muslims was quite traumatic for many volunteers, and it led to a weird bending of reality where all of their preconceptions about this noble cause they thought they had signed up for were uncomfortably shattered. In fact, because many volunteers had come to aid the noble and defenseless Greeks and were driven by idealistic notions of chivalry, some even began helping Muslim families to escape Greek violence. This, of course, infuriated the Greek revolutionaries, who grew increasingly frustrated with these starry-eyed buffoons who, to them, knew nothing about local politics and were not aware of the brutal reality of centuries spent under the repressive and violent thumb of Ottoman rule. Yet, even as many of these volunteers were crazy naive, most of them did heroically and pretty selflessly join the fight alongside the Greeks, lending what military expertise they had and providing extra manpower in several battles against the Ottomans. And though they would be helpful to the Greeks, who were in no position to turn away any help, the initial wave of volunteers was still somewhat small, and these early Philhellenes did not make a decisive difference for the Greeks just yet. However, they did set an early example in Europe, and the movement would become ever more important as the Greek struggle continued on indefinitely, and as more and more people became sympathetic to the cause. The man who would prove to make a real difference for the Greeks was the English poet Lord Byron. An enormously famous and somewhat scandalous celebrity of the time, Lord Byron was a beloved figure in the early years of Romanticism, and he was well known for his passion for Greek culture. When the revolution first broke out, Byron was living in Italy, kind of amongst the same scene that our old friend Mavrocordatos had been living in before he set off to put together Greece's first constitution. Like Mavrocordatos, Lord Byron was close with Mary and Percy Shelley, and he attended Percy Shelley's cremation in the summer of 1821 after the fellow English Romantic poet had died in a tragic boating accident. Like many of our Philhellenes, Byron had become a bit bored of his life living in aristocratic luxury on Italy's Mediterranean coast. Feeling ready for a change, Byron decided to accept an invitation he received in 1823 to lend his aid to the Greek cause. So in July, Byron boarded a ship called the Hercules, headed for the Greek Isles. And though the name of this ship is a pretty good representation of the idealized vision of the Greeks as mythological heroes, Lord Byron himself had a surprisingly grounded conception of what he was getting himself into. Byron had long been interested in Greek culture, a fact illuminated through his poetry, and he was not only interested in the ancients, like most Philhellenes, but he also took an interest in the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, Byron had actually traveled to the Ottoman Empire before signing up, which was pretty unbelievable, not just for the Philhellenes, but even for many of the leaders of the Philikia Tyria. Because of this, Byron knew that he was not headed for a land filled with Greek gods, but was instead quite conscious of the fact that he was about to insert his enormous wealth and status into an incredibly complex conflict with many different competing interests. Even with this interest in Ottoman politics and culture, though, nothing could have prepared Byron for what he was about to step into. When Byron's ship arrived in the Ionian Islands in the late summer of 1823, the Greeks were on the cusp of an all-out civil war amongst the competing revolutionary factions. Within this environment, word quickly spread that an incredibly rich and influential English aristocrat had come to help the Greeks, and many leaders began courting the young poet. As you might expect, the cultivated and European-loving Mavrokordatos, who shared many of Byron's friends, was the one who had the most success in this courtship. At this point, Mavrokordatos had fully solidified his alliance with the Greek islanders, as he and the islanders were now pitted against the warlords of the Peloponnese. As we noted last week, as Mavrokordatos was building the skeleton of a central government for Greece, he was also putting together a network of alliances, not only within his territorial base of western mainland Greece, but also within the Greek Isles. Mavrokordatos made these alliances specifically at the expense of Peloponnesian leaders like Kolokotrones, because he felt that it was important to check the power of the Peloponnesian warlords who controlled the largest territorial area now under direct Greek rule. Some of the maps on the website, 20thCenturyRevolutions.com, are helpful here, but to give you some geographical idea of what we're talking about, basically you have the Peloponnesian Peninsula smack dab in the middle of the Greek-controlled territory. This had been quickly taken by Kolokotrones and the other Peloponnesians in 1821, and still represented the greatest gains of the revolution. Then, to the north of the Peloponnese, you have Mavrokordatos's home base in western mainland Greece. Then, surrounding the entire Peloponnese are the Greek Isles, home to the great shipping magnates with whom Mavrokordatos had been forging alliances over the past year. What this amounted to was a powerful center within the Peloponnese that was surrounded by territory mostly controlled by fellow Greeks. However, these Greeks were increasingly becoming the rivals of the warlords in the Peloponnesian center. Peloponnesian leaders began to sense these shifting alliances. So, after serving as president of the Provisional Administration for about a year, Mavrokordatos had been physically threatened and forced by the most powerful Peloponnesian kleptic leader of them all, Kolokotrones, to flee to the islands where he sought shelter amongst his islander allies. And once again proving himself to be incredibly lucky, Mavrokordatos got to be the one to welcome Lord Byron to Greece due to this exile at the hands of the Peloponnese, because Lord Byron, by coincidence, landed in the Greek Isles instead of on the Peloponnese. Mavrokordatos and his islander allies understood the enormous potential of having Byron on their side, and they were able to quickly win him over. Lord Byron, for his part, seemed to understand that no unified government really existed at this point, but he nonetheless saw Mavrokordatos as having the potential to become a unifying force, at one point describing him as a George Washington-like figure. Now enamored with Mavrokordatos, Byron lent the islanders a large sum of money to outfit their fleet of ships, and then he decided to accompany Mavrokordatos to Messaloniki instead of going to Tripolitsa, which had been his original plan. In this way, Byron clearly signaled that he was taking a side in the impending civil war, throwing his weight behind Mavrokordatos and the islanders at the expense of the leaders in the Peloponnese. Byron would arrive in Messaloniki in early 1824. And though he did begin organizing a military force under his leadership, he could not see this venture through to its end because he became seriously ill within just a couple of months. This illness would in fact lead to his death that April. Byron's arrival in Greece had been extremely important. However, his death would prove to be potentially the most important event within the entire Philhellene movement in its ability to gain widespread support for the Greeks throughout Europe. The death of Lord Byron was nothing short of a sensation, and he instantly became a hero, not just back home in England, where he was already widely adored, but in Greece as well, where he became immortalized as a selfless martyr who had given his life for the cause. Byron's body was embalmed and shipped back to London, where a huge funeral service was held for him, and according to legend, Byron's heart was cut out of his body and kept behind in Greece. And though the story is likely apocryphal, it does express the intense love that the Greeks felt for Byron. And as so often happens with young artists who die before their time, he was only 36, Byron became even more famous in death than he had been when he was alive. This became especially true as Romanticism grew as a cultural movement in Europe throughout the 1820s. Importantly for the Revolution, a large part of Byron's legend came to revolve around how he had selflessly died while nobly fighting for a cause he deeply believed in. Within the emerging world of Romanticism, this legend was heightened even further by the fact that Byron was not himself a Greek, but had joined on a purely human level. In this way, Byron helped turn the Greek Revolution into an early example of what we might now understand as a humanitarian cause. Within England and France especially, Byron's death was important in making the plight of the Greeks the hot topic of the day within some of the most elite circles who stood against the European conservative monarchs currently in power. For example, the Duc d'Orléans, the cousin of the current French King Charles, who would himself be declared King of the French in a few short years after the July Revolution, showed his support for the Greeks by setting up a philanthropic committee to raise money for the Greeks. At one point, the Orléans court even threw around the idea of trying to get one of the Duke's sons to be crowned King of Greece after independence had been won. Through the patronage of the Duc d'Orléans, the Greek cause became one way in which respectable French society could express their dislike of the Bourbon King Charles, who was currently in power and who for the time being held fast to the pro-Ottoman status quo of French foreign policy. Like in France, the official policy of the English government was to follow the lead of the Holy Alliance in supporting the Ottomans. However, elite liberal circles were becoming ever more vocal in their support for the Greeks. In London, this not only took the form of philanthropy, but also became wrapped up in early speculative ventures within the emerging world of international capitalism. In the wake of Napoleon, the British would become ever more dominant within the game of great power politics through a somewhat new strategy centered around finance. London would eventually become known later in the 19th century as the world's banker, largely due to a growing culture of speculative lending within the British capital. In the early 1820s, this movement, which eventually would see London become the center of global finance, was still largely in its infancy, and so was going through some growing pains. And these growing pains primarily took the form of crazy harebrained Ponzi schemes that make Bernie Madoff, Enron, and the Fire Festival look like pretty sound investment opportunities. The most well-known of these schemes was the infamous Poyet scheme of Gregor MacGregor, in which he swindled investors by making up an entire nation in Central America, fabricating a fantastical array of maps, constitutional documents, a coat of arms, and even designing army uniforms. With schemes like this going around, it was no wonder that the Greeks actually had quite a bit of luck in securing loans from investors in London, who were pretty interested in putting their money behind countries that, at least might exist one day, even if they were at the moment fighting for their independence. At the very least, investors knew that Greece was like a real place with real people. But this did not stop those securing the loans from painting beautiful pictures of a pastoral land filled with productive farmers, led by mythological Greek heroes who all get along splendidly. They almost always failed to mention that, in fact, Greece was on the verge of a civil war, and that years of revolutionary fighting had made the country unproductive, to say the least. The man at the heart of securing these loans was a narcissistic and bombastic English imperialist who would one day become the governor of Hong Kong. But for now, John Bowring was a kind of capitalist adventurer who would basically invest in new and up-and-coming nations, like the Greeks, securing funds for them but also advising them on how best to run their government. Bowring was part of a growing movement of international English businessmen and political advisors we can understand as early examples of what would become very common in the late 20th century when Western European and American financiers fanned out across the globe to offer loans and sage administrative advice to governments that would grow ever more dependent on their powerful benefactors. Interestingly, one of the main ideological underpinnings for this growth in speculative finance, coupled with political consulting in the 1820s, was the utilitarian philosophy of Jeremy Bentham. And in fact, John Bowring, the force behind securing a loan for the Greeks, was an avid follower and even close confidant of the aging Bentham. Now in his 70s, Jeremy Bentham was at the height of his popularity, and he had a large cohort of fanatical disciples who saw it as their mission to spread the gospel of Bentham's utilitarian political philosophy. For these Benthamites, the new revolutionary governments, which had started to sprout up across Central and South America, as well as in Spain and of course now Greece, served as excellent testing grounds for their ideas, which they believed were universally applicable no matter what the local conditions happened to be. Mavrocordatos, of course, knew how to handle such paternalistic Englishmen like John Bowring, and as they had done with Lord Byron, he and his government backed the push to secure these loans from the English. In fact, Mavrocordatos guided these negotiations in such a way as to make sure that the money remained in the hands of him and his allies amongst the shipping magnates of the islands, and more importantly, out of the hands of the Peloponnesian warlords. Kolokotrones was a perceptive guy and could tell that he was being outwitted in the arena of courting Western European investors. So it became commonplace for him and his allies to rail against the quote-unquote foreigners, such as Mavrocordatos, who were treacherously making the Greeks forever beholden to English and French imperialists. Now, Kolokotrones did have a point here, though for the time being it really didn't matter much, and the fact that Mavrocordatos and the islanders had English investors backing them gave them the advantage they would need to gain the upper hand after a second round of fighting broke out between the Greek factions in late 1824. What this meant was that by early 1825, Kolokotrones and other Peloponnesian notables and clefs were captured by Mavrocordatos' central administration and imprisoned in western mainland Greece, which was now firmly in the hands of the islander shipping magnates of the islands. We have been dancing around the islanders, as we have called them, for quite some time, and I didn't want to throw too many names into the mix early on. But now they are controlling the government. We do need to introduce at least the most important notables from the most important island. The island of Hydra was home to some incredibly wealthy shipping families who had grown ever more important once the Greek revolutions were in need of not only naval power, but also international trade connections to bring in the materials necessary to fight a war. The most important of these shipping magnates from the island of Hydra would be the Kondoriotis brothers. And yeah, you can see why I haven't introduced them yet, since their name sounds almost exactly like Kolokotrones. But remember, the incredibly wealthy Kondoriotis brothers are the rivals of Kolokotrones, the Klephtic warlord. The Kondoriotis family was insanely rich, and they were an important source of funding throughout the revolution. with access to this wealth and to their fleet of ships, as well as through their strategic alliance with Mavrocordatos, the Kondoriotis brothers were able to secure leadership of the provisional government by 1824. This meant that they were the principal beneficiaries of the English loans coming in, and these loans allowed them to suppress the Peloponnesian warlords. So as the Greeks began the year of 1825, the Kondoriotis brothers, along with Mavrocordatos, were running the show, and had now captured Kolokotrones and other Peloponnesian rivals. But all of this was about to change because the Sultan had finally gotten his stuff together, and he made really what was the first and maybe only good decision in fighting the Greek rebels. He decided to get help from the Egyptians. And so next week, Muhammad Ali will step into the ring. And yeah, I couldn't resist a boxing metaphor right there. But no, not that Muhammad Ali, but Muhammad Ali Pasha, the founder of modern Egypt, whose army, unlike the Sultan's, was actually somewhat competent. And once Muhammad Ali's Egyptian forces landed in the Peloponnese, things really began to go south for the Greeks, and they would have to, once again, forget all of their rivalries, backstabbing, and intrigue and try their very, very best to unify their efforts, as independence was now more threatened than it had been since the revolution began.